Hey guys, welcome to Theology 3 honors for the fourth quarter. We're in Unit 7 talking about Chapter 5, and obviously the focus of this chapter is the first three commandments of the Bible, particularly as they pertain to our obligations to God and what they entail as far as how we're called to respond to Him. The focus of the first section is faith, hope, charity, and religion, three different virtues. Three of them are theological, one of them obviously is not. So, just a broad overview, summary of the chapter really quickly, then a summary of this first section that you're responsible for, and then we'll move into a couple of points and then going over your Unit 7 questions. Okay? So, the overall view of this chapter is this. The theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity allow us to know things of God that exceed our own human understanding. They give us confidence in God's promises, and they help us relate to God and our fellow man, the people around us, with Christ-like love. So, what I just said, faith, hope, charity. Religion is a virtue, right? And very specifically, it is the virtue of giving God due worship. Um, we talked about justice as a cardinal virtue earlier in the year, giving what we owe to the other. Well, the reality is we can't give God what we owe him. So, in many ways, religion is actually related to the cardinal virtue of justice, but because of who we are and who God is, we do fall short of that, okay? So, how then do we carry out as best we can as human beings the obligation to be just toward God? And the answer is religion. And so, God gave us the Sabbath to the chosen people, to uh, His people, us. We are the summation of His people. We are the continuation of His people. And he gave it to us as a day of worship and rest, which is what you're really focusing on Friday and then Monday before we have our quiz on Tuesday. From the beginning, the early church celebrated the Eucharist on the first day of the week, right? And Christians retain the Sabbath obligation to rest on Sunday as the continuing tradition, right? Capital T tradition. So that's the overall view where we get from faith, hope, and charity, which I'm about to talk about, through the third commandment and keeping the Lord's Day holy. There you go. That's the overview of the chapter. This first section, which you guys should know is on pages 128 through 136. It'll also be in the caption at the beginning, so you know what to be looking for. But this section essentially is this. The worship of God, also known as the virtue of religion, obligates people to believe in faith, trust in hope, and love God. So, just a quick aside about hope. Hope is more than trust, right? It is a desire for that which God promises us, which through faith we believe. So, trust is the right answer as far as hope, but hope goes beyond. It is a desire, a want of that which God promises. So, quite simply, again, going back to the theological virtues, faith, supernatural gift through which we freely accept what God has revealed to us, i.e., divine revelation, that has, as it has been interpreted and taught by the church. Hope, theological virtue by which one looks forward to the happiness of eternal life with God, i.e., heaven, and charity. The greatest of these, as per St. Paul, is the theological virtue by which Christians are able to love God above all things and their neighbor as themselves. Okay, so that's that. So if those are what they are, then what do we do that kind of damages them? And that leads you into. Sorry, I didn't mean to give you guys the finger there. Sorry. it leads us into your first four short answer questions. Um, Short answer number one: what are sins against faith? Number two: what are sins against hope? Number three: what are sins against charity? And number four: what is the basis of the sins against religion? Okay. So the sins against faith, and your textbook goes over five of them: voluntary doubt, schism, heresy, apostasy, and atheism. Okay. So what are each of those things? Voluntary doubt. Um, when we talk about there's a matter of degrees for these, so I need to be careful in how I explain them to you. Voluntary doubt is intentional, right? It is intentionally calling into question the truth of some aspect of divine revelation. Schism is intentional. Heresy is intentional. Apostasy is intentional. Atheism is intentional, right? So there is an intention behind all these, and the intention is to thwart, if you will, the gift of faith. Okay. So schism. Schism is a refusal to submit to the authority of the Pope or bishops in communion with the Pope. It is, in many ways, a lack of faith in what God has revealed as far as who he left as his earthly authority, right? Peter and those that succeed him. Heresy is the denial of a very specific tenet of the Catholic faith. Now, that's not bad in and of itself, but what makes heresy heresy is that it's by someone who has been baptized. That is, someone who has accepted the Catholic faith and now is rejecting a portion of it for whatever reason. Apostasy. Okay, if heresy is rejecting of one thing, one particular teaching, apostasy is the outright rejection of all the teachings that you, as a baptized person, have professed to believe. Which leads us to atheism and kind of what it's tied to today in modern society, which is agnosticism. In many cases, if someone says they're an agnostic, they're telling you that they're an atheist. Agnosticism and atheism are not the same thing, but in practice, they end up being the same thing. Agnosticism is essentially, you need to prove to me that God exists, which of course there is no evidence that would be proof in the eyes of someone who claims to be an agnostic. So in kind of practicality and in kinds of actual work, they're atheists. And atheist is a denial of God's existence. So the agnostic will say, oh, it's not that I don't believe in it, but you need to prove it to me. But since we are not able to prove in a way that they would accept, practice is atheism. So those are the sins against faith. Sins against hope. There's two, and you really only need to know both of them, and they're kind of one end and the other. They are despair and presumption. So despair is lack of hope, or a deficiency of hope, if you will. It's the idea, and this is an example, it's not kind of the entirety of what despair is, but this is a pretty good example. Despair is, I did sin X, and it's so bad that God will never forgive me. Wrong. God will forgive you for pretty much any and every sin that you commit. Okay? And on the other kind of extreme end is presumption, which is, God's going to forgive me for whatever I do, right? Which is true to an extent. God will, but you need that component of contrition. You need to actually be sorry for it. So what am I talking about as far as presumption? So once all this stuff ends and you're able to go back out and see your friends and stuff, when you go out on a Friday night and say, well, I'm going to have sex with my boyfriend or girlfriend, and then I'm going to go to confession on Saturday because I know that God is going to forgive me for my sins. Well, that's presumption. You're presuming, A, that you're going to make it to Saturday, and B, that God is going to forgive you for something that you're clearly not sorry about because you're going to go out and do it, right? So that is the sin of presumption, which is a sin against hope. The third question, the sins against charity, right? Indifference, ingratitude, lukewarmness, spiritual sloth, sometimes it's referred to as asthedia, and hatred of God. So those all sound kind of like the same thing, right? Um, they're not. They're not the same thing, and they are different from each other. So what is what? And you do need to know these, so that's why I'm going over this stuff. Indifference is a lack of commitment in the exercise of your faith. Um, Symptoms of this kind of skipping mass or not praying, right? Um, why is it wrong? Well, Christ is pretty clear. We are called to make our faith a priority in our lives uh, because it's how we show love, right? Love to God and also to neighbor, right? So that's indifference. Ingratitude is a failure to recognize and acknowledge the blessings that God has given you, right? How's that a sin against love? Well, God created you out of love, right? And failure to thank God for the good that we possess, it's a disordered sense of entitlement that God owes you something, right? That's the problem here. Spiritual sloth or acedia, sometimes spiritual laziness is another way of expressing this one, um, is really a sadness or dejection of the will, right? So we talked about being beings, if you will, of intellect and will. So when we look at this one, it's really manifests through the will. Sadness or dejection of the will regarding the divine good one possesses, right? So it shows a lack of um, valuing the spiritual goods that we possess. So what is how do we show spiritual sloth? Well, I think you can kind of reason it out. Um, like we don't want to. We have an aversion to um, serving God, right? Doing what God asks us to do. We flee from God and take on the stuff of this world, right? That's spiritual sloth. We reject God's love for us and the response that it naturally engenders and turn away, right? So spiritual sloth. Lukewarmness, right? It is a degree of spiritual sloth, right? If spiritual sloth is kind of not doing anything, lukewarmness is doing stuff but just doing it like bleh, doing the old meh, right? Oh God, you want me to do so? Oh, I'll do it, right? Pretty much anytime Mrs. Motley asks me to do something, when I do that, like the right, that's a sign of lukewarmness. Um, and how is that a problem when it comes to love? Well, think about it. Like you're not giving your whole heart to something. You're not showing the fullness of who you are and giving it to, in this case, God, right? So it is the kind of going through the motions, right? And how do we manifest this? Like showing up to mass 5 minutes after it started. Um, when you pray, you do it like with your mind thinking about, you know, oh, what can I do to get a better score in Fortnite or whatever? You're distracted, right? That's how lukewarmness kind of creeps in. And finally, hatred of God. In many ways, like this is the most obvious, it's a willful anger toward God out of distaste for his laws, right? Resentment over the consequences of our own personal sins, um, or because of some severe, tragic suffering going on in our lives that we can't comprehend, right? You're kind of unable to understand it, and you kind of manifest your misunderstanding through anger that's directed at God. Um, the problem with this is it's rooted in pride, right? Uh, it's rooted in pride over God not following what we want him to do, right? God, how dare you not do what I want you to do, right? When you say it out loud, it sounds ridiculous. God, why didn't you do what I, oh yeah, right? And that's the problem. And I gotta say, this is the one that I think I fall into the most, is my anger that manifests. It's often directed at God for not doing what I know is best. And of course, I don't know what's best. God does. Okay. Um, and how does it manifest? Cursing God for forbidden behaviors, inflicting punishment, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And finally, number 4, sins against religion. They are kind of all under the category of irreligion, really. So when we talk about religion, first and foremost, we have to talk, how do we express it? And obviously, like going to Mass is one of those, but Mass falls under the category of types of prayer, right? Prayers of adoration, thanksgiving, contrition, and petition. So prayer is the ways that we manifest this virtue, right? So when we talk about prayers, uh, we should kind of understand there's a difference. Adoration. So when we show adoration, when we prayer of adoration, we're expressing love, right? Uh, Thanksgiving. It's pretty much what it sounds like. We're giving thanks for the gifts, right? The blessings that we've been bestowed with. Contrition. Saying sorry, right? Sorry for the things that you've done. And of course, the one that I think we do the most often, I would say for most of us, the bulk of our prayer life involves petition, asking God for stuff. And here's the deal, guys. Uh, God absolutely answers us. We might not always like the answer. Oftentimes it's no, right? But that's still an answer. And that no is not always no forever. It can be no for right now. Okay, so then again, getting back to the sins against religion, they're really more what we would call sins of irreligion, right? So irreligion is its opposite. Um, Tempting God, sacrilege, simony, um, satanic worship, magic, divination, idolatry. Idolatry is number one, right? Idolatry is rooted in pride, obviously, and idolatry is putting something before God. Usually, when we talk about idolatry, in this case, we're talking very specifically worshiping something other than God. And we're going to notice that for irreligion, most of them kind of spring off of this. So, what is each of these things? Um, so, irreligion is one of them, and I'm going to give you some more specific ones when we get there. But idolatry is number one. So idolatry uh, is exactly what I said. You know, worshiping something other than God as God. Number 2, superstition is any kind of uh, practice or belief that we have uh, where we're trying to basically attribute to something that's not God something good. Like when you have your lucky rabbit's foot, right, and rub it for good luck. Well, that's not how. First of all, luck isn't a thing. Sorry to break that to you, but that's not how it works, right? When we ask for stuff, the universe, if you will, we're really asking God, right? We're asking God for stuff, and we get a yes or a no. Uh, but when we look to stuff other than Him, that's what we're talking about. So in many ways, is idolatry related to superstition, and superstition to idolatry more correctly? Yes, right? Divination, right? So superstition, divination, magic are all kind of rooted in the same thing. You're seeking stuff from God outside of God, right? Divination, you're seeking answers for the future, right? Or to obtain information which can't be known. It is by its very nature supernatural. If something is supernatural, it's outside of nature. If it's outside of nature, whose domain is it? God's, right? Magic, right? That if divination is about seeking knowledge, magic is about seeking power, usually power over others. Um, Satanic worship is exactly what it sounds like, worshiping Satan instead of God. Worship of the devil. It's not good. Don't do that. So there you go. And then finally, irreligion. Irreligion are practices that are disrespectful to God, right? Uh, and mockery of God's goodness in many ways. So, how do we kind of see this in action? Tempting God, right? Sacrilege, simony, right? Those are the three that I mentioned way back, like a couple minutes ago. But those are 3 forms of irreligion. What is each of those things? If you think back to the story from the Gospel of, um, I think it's Matthew. Don't quote me on that. where we see the temptations of Jesus by the devil, right? That's irreligion. Testing God's goodness and power with an unreasonable expectation. Like, God, if you would give me this good grade, I know I didn't do any studying, but if I could get this good grade, I'd be so happy. Like, that's tempting God. Like, you didn't put the work in. Like, he's not, he shouldn't, and I wouldn't think he would kind of miraculously give you the answers, right? You need to learn a lesson in those situations. And sometimes, you know more than you think you know, right? But God is not going to do something bad for good, right? So tempting God is irreligion. Sacrilege, um, serious disrespect to something that is holy, a holy object, holy person, etc. Um, like receiving communion in a state of mortal sin. That's an example of sacrilege. And finally, simony. Simony is related to sacrilege. It is the buying or selling of religious, spiritual goods or church offices. Um, People, when they think of this, usually go to like the Middle Ages, which is when it was prevalent and when the church really cracked down on it. But it's something that's been around the church from the very beginning. Um, the reason when we talked about indulgences, people were like, oh, those are bad, right? Well, part of that is because of simony. A selling of an indulgence is simony. Okay? So that is section 1. I promise this is the longest one. The rest of these are going to be much shorter. Obviously, it's the longest one. It was like a bunch of pages in your textbook. So I'm going to move on to part 2 here in just a second. You don't need to watch it right away. Love you guys. See you guys in just a bit.